Greetings, comrades! So today we continue our stories about people who one day woke up in a beautiful Soviet country and said, "Today I'm leaving it forever." Let me remind you that since the 1930s, emigration from the USSR was considered equivalent to treason and was punishable by penalties up to a firing squad. In the first part I mentioned all the legal ways to do it, marry a foreigner or be a Jew, as well as those not so legal but available to a certain group of people: world celebrities, diplomats, intelligence officers and military pilots. Now we move on to mere mortals. Were there any chances? There were, but people often had to come up with absolutely unique ways to escape. So, here are the most insane ways of leaving the Soviet Union for good. Today we are going to talk more about specific stories, but we still need to categorize them somehow. And I've got an idea. Water, earth, fire, air. Long ago, the four nations lived together in harmony, but nah, I'm kidding of course, but only partially. After all, the stories of escapes from the USSR can really be divided by elements. Earth, to cross a land border for example with Iran or Turkey. Water, to try to swim to the distant west, and air, probably the most difficult option unless you're a professional pilot. I guess only fire doesn't fit here, I haven't heard any stories like that. And let's start with air, that is, with some flights across the Iron Curtain. As I said in the last video, the easiest way to escape the USSR is to be at the helm of a secret military fighter jet. But what if you're not a military pilot, or just not a pilot at all? Basically, you have two ways. First, you can try to build your own airplane. In 1970, a group of Armenian aviation modelers tried to fly to Turkey on a homemade airplane they had constructed, and on which they installed a scrapped engine from a training airplane of the local Dosaf club. But they crashed. Experts later discovered that the plane was built almost perfectly. Everything was calculated correctly, except the wind direction during takeoff was slightly off, which caused the accident. Two brothers from Lvov region tried to implement a similar plan in 1975. It had a motor from a Dnieper motorcycle and, as you can imagine, the plane did not even take off. But one person managed to fly out of Czechoslovakia in this way. Iva Zhdarsky built a homemade motorized glider, equipped it with a Trabant car engine, and successfully flew to Vienna at the age of 24. Czechoslovaks in general were notable for their ability to escape by air. One can also remember Robert Gutyra, who flew across the Iron Curtain in a hot air balloon with his family in 1983. But what if you're not a genius aircraft designer and can't just fly off into the sunset in a self-made jet? The only thing left is to take a ticket for an ordinary passenger flight and try to hijack it. You won't believe it, but in the entire history of the Soviet Union there were more than 100 of airplane hijacking attempts, more than 20 of them successful. In 1990 alone there were 33 cases of airplane hijacking attempts. One would think that after the first 100 attempts it would be worth it to somehow increase the level of security, but no. I will not describe all of them, especially since they mostly follow the same script. You get into your seat, wait for takeoff, say you have a bomb or a gun, demonstrate them if necessary, demand that the plane be turned around to any western country, and then neck or nothing. Though, to be fair, only around 80% of attempts to hijack airplanes in the USSR were related to the desire to fly to the west. Meanwhile, flight mechanic Polyakov, who was one of the first to do so in 1954, had a much more noble goal. He hijacked an airplane to ram it into his ex-wife's house. But he changed his mind during the flight.
I changed my mind!
However, until 1970, hijackers were never able to finish the job. This year is notable for 3 airplane hijackings at once, but for different reasons. The first hijacking was a group of 16 Jews agreeing in advance to buy tickets for one flight in order to hijack it and leave for Israel. However, they were arrested before boarding the plane, and afterwards they announced that it was all a political protest, and they were not going to actually seize anything. The second hijacking, two Lithuanians, Pranas Brazinskas and his 15-year-old son Algidras Brazinskas, successfully hijacked an An-24 airplane and forced the pilots to fly to Turkey, killing the flight attendant in the process. It was the first successful escape with hijacking of a passenger plane in the history of the USSR. They were jailed in Turkey, but after 4 years they were released to the USA for some reason, where they were accepted and given citizenship. To put it mildly, a controversial act. But karma did catch up with the terrorists. In 2002, 46-year-old Albert Victor White, new name of Algidras Brazinskas, living in the United States, killed his father Frank White, Pranas, during a family quarrel. Finally, the third hijacking in 1970 was the most paradoxical. Inspired by the example of the Lithuanians, two students hijacked a lead L-200 airplane bloodlessly, and also landed it in Turkey. But there they were in for a shock. The Turkish authorities believed that the hijackers were Soviet spies, and they spent almost 6 months checking them for KGB affiliation before granting them asylum. By that time they had been forgotten. The Turks gave them a room in a barracks and a meager allowance. Other Western countries did not want to accept them either. The USA was not interested in them. As a result, after a year, the hijackers accepted the fact that they were not welcome in the West, repented, and returned to the Soviet Union, receiving relatively mild sentences of about 10 years each. Apparently, these successful cases inspired followers, and as a result, attempted hijackings became more frequent. Even though after the incident, the USSR introduced the practice of sending an armed policeman in civilian clothes on flights close to the state border, just in case.
Just in case, you know.
For example, the largest terrorist attack in the history of the Soviet Union occurred during an attempt to hijack a Tu-104A airplane in order to turn it towards the PRC. A policeman who was on board shot the terrorist, but he managed to activate the bomb, and as a result, 81 people were killed. Later there were several more successful hijackings, usually to Turkey or Sweden. A couple of times the hijackers tried to fly to Finland, but the authorities of that country instantly extradited them back to the USSR. Similarly, in 1990, a group of 15 prisoners who were being transported to Yakutsk on a regular flight did not plan their route very well, to put it mildly. They managed to hijack an airplane and fly it to Tashkent, where 4 of the hijackers, convicted on not the most serious articles, judiciously assessed their chances and preferred to surrender to the authorities. But the others demanded that the pilots fly to Pakistan. They flew to Pakistan, and the plane was even allowed to land, but right at the airport all the hijackers were seized and quickly sentenced to death. Miscalculated, but where? Finally, 3 more very high-profile cases that occurred in the 1980s. In 1983, priest Timuras Chikladze gave his church parishioners from among a group of Georgian golden youth an idea of running away to the West with weapons. As a result, 7 kids of fairly high-profile parents decided to hijack a passenger plane. The most idiotic thing is that many of them had previously traveled abroad on tourist vouchers and in general had a chance to emigrate in that way. But the perpetrators were driven by a thirst for glory and a desire to be welcomed abroad as ideological fighters against the Soviet regime. But it turned out differently. They seized the plane but were unable to take off for Turkey, and they did not know how to use their weapons very well either. According to the recollections of special forces, the operation lasted about 15 seconds. All but one of the terrorists were either killed during the assault or sentenced to death. A similar scheme was attempted in 1988, but the story is even wilder. The hostage-taking was carried out by the family jazz band Seven Simeons, consisting of 51-year-old Ninel Ovechkina and her 7 sons. They said that they were prompted to do so by the decline in popularity. The ensemble was losing its charm and consequently its fans as the sons grew up. The Ovechkins carried aboard the plane 2 sawed-off shotguns, 100 rounds of ammunition, and improvised explosive devices in a double-bass case. With them there were also 3 daughters of Ninel. The youngest children were only 9 and 10 years old. The hijacking was successful, but as always their planning failed. There was not enough fuel to get to London, and the plane was forced to land near the Finnish border, where the storming took place. 5 members of the Ovechkin family, Ninel and 4 older sons, shot themselves, realizing that their plan had failed, while the younger ones managed to escape. By the way, it was 1988, they could have waited just like 3 more years. Finally, in 1988, another more sophisticated scheme was carried out. 4 employees of a local bus depot hijacked a bus, lured a group of school children and their teachers into it by forging papers and telling the teachers that the school management had sent the bus, took them hostage and demanded $3 million and a plane to Pakistan, but then changed their minds and chose Israel. Surprisingly, they were given the plane in exchange for some of the hostages. The terrorists left the bus and moved to the airplane covering behind children, and then released them. The crew of the Il-76 remained hostage and the plane was allowed to fly. The plane landed in Israel, but the terrorists overestimated the coolness of relations between the USSR and Israel. The Israelis themselves had often fallen victim to Arab terrorists, so they had no sympathy for the fugitives. They immediately handed them back to the Soviet Union, only asking that they not be subjected to the death penalty. So, shall we move on to the water element? There was another way, by sea. I think almost everyone knows the story of Valery Sablin, who in 1975 revolted on the ship Starzhevoy and tried to take it to Sweden. He failed to follow through and was executed a year later. In general, it was quite difficult to hijack a huge ocean liner, so usually you had to get to the shores of capitalism on your own. The first mega swimmer was Pyotr Patrushev, by the way a candidate for the Tokyo Olympics for the USSR swimming team. He joined the army, encountered hazing, faked insanity and ended up in a mental hospital, but soon escaped from there. Next, he wanted to escape from the USSR. Patrushev estimated that it was only 15 kilometers from Batumi to the Turkish border, but it was dangerous to swim straight through, so he decided to detour as much as 30 kilometers to bypass the border boats. Peter managed to swim across the border and reach Turkey, but his ordeal did not end there. The Turkish authorities did not believe that a man could physically cross the Black Sea by swimming, considered Patrushev a Soviet spy and sent him under arrest. Only 2 years later he managed to prove his innocence, was released and went to live in Australia. Yuri Vitohin in turn is unique in that he tried to escape from the USSR by swimming unsuccessfully twice. In August 1963 he also bought a ticket to Batumi and tried to swim 15 kilometers to the Turkish coast, but failed to cope with the strong coastal current, and after 20 hours of fruitless struggle with the waves he was forced to come ashore, as it turned out almost 60 kilometers from Batumi, in Poti. He was handed over to police, but they were unable to prove his intent and let him go. He claimed that he was just a marathon swimmer. 4 years later he made a second attempt to escape. He set sail from Koktebel on the Black Sea towards Turkey, managed to evade the border boats and by morning found himself dozens of kilometers from the shore. Then he decided to inflate the boat he was towing behind him to rest. A passing warship spotted him and he had to come aboard and confess to everything. But the Black Sea was not the only way. Thus, on the night of December 13, 1974, Stanislav Kurylov, a 30-year-old tourist from Leningrad, jumped into the open ocean from a cruise liner with the symbolic name Soviet Union. The man had only a snorkel mask and flippers with him. The Soviet daredevil swam about 100 kilometers in the ocean before arriving at the Promised Land. This journey took the man 3 days, without food, water, sleep or rest, surrounded by sharks, reefs and huge waves. An absolutely crazy but successful escape. And the most surprising thing is that Kurylov was an oceanographer and had access to classified data, so he could not travel abroad. But he bought a ticket for the Vladivostok Equator Vladivostok tour, where a visa was not required as the ship did not enter any foreign ports. The problem was that the route of the tour was not published anywhere, and Kurylov had to plot the approximate route of the ship on his own, using a map and guided by the stars. He calculated the point where the ship would be closer to the Philippine islet of Siargao and jumped from 14 meters into the ocean. How he managed not only to survive 3 days in the ocean, but also to get to the right point navigating by the stars is a mystery. A similar scheme was pulled off by another person, this time a girl, but she did not have to swim hundreds of kilometers. On January 14, 1979, 18-year-old Soviet waitress Liliana Gasinskaya jumped out of the window of a cruise liner off the coast of Australia and swam to the shore of Sydney. Liliana did not take her documents and belongings with her. The young beauty was wearing only a small red swimsuit, which later became her hallmark all over the world's media. A girl in a red bikini who escaped from the USSR. She was inspired by the story of Kirill, whose escape she heard about at the age of 14, and since then she has been preparing her plan for 4 years. Entered the Odessa Maritime Tourist Service College to specialize as a ship waiter, and during her very first cruise she jumped overboard. Liliana quickly found an admirer among Australian reporters who left his wife and 3 children for her in 2 weeks, and in 6 months she graced the cover of the famous erotic magazine Penthouse. Then Liliana tried her hand as a disco dancer, DJ and soap opera actress, starred in a couple of Australian TV series. In general, she did everything that was unavailable to her in the hated USSR. But an even more radical step than jumping to Australian sharks in a bikini 9 years before Liliana was taken by Daina Polena, a 25-year-old native of Soviet Latvia. That day, the Soviet fishing vessel on which the girl worked as a cook and waitress was 150-200 kilometers off the US coast. Suddenly, the captain received a report. One of the kitchen staff, Daina, was badly poisoned and lost consciousness. The girl's condition was deteriorating. After examining Daina, the captain realized that the situation was bad and without emergency medical assistance the girl would die. The officer gave a distress signal and contacted the US Coast Guard. The Americans sent a helicopter to help. When the victim was lifted on board, the girl was already in a coma. The girl was brought to the shore and miraculously saved. After regaining consciousness, Daina immediately said that she had swallowed some pills just to get to the US territory and asked for political asylum. The Soviet waitress was of little value to the United States, but her desperate act impressed Washington. A few weeks later, Daina was granted refugee status and then American citizenship. By the way, remember I said that Yuri Vitohin is unique in that he failed to escape the Soviet Union by sea twice. Still, in his story there is one more escape, a successful one. After 10 years of imprisonment for his second attempt, he made another, also following the footsteps of Stanislav Kurylov. He jumped out of the cabin of a cruise liner passing by Indonesia, sailed about 30 kilometers in 20 hours, got to one of the islands from where he was taken away by locals passing by the island on a motorboat. Success. And the status of the most stubborn fugitive from the USSR is deservedly his. Finally, the strangest story of all is the case described by writer Eric Scott in his recent book Defectors. So, 1958. Sailor Viktor Oreshkov, when his ship was returning to the Soviet Union from a voyage abroad, jumped into the waters of the Bosphorus Strait in Istanbul. Oreshkov was checked by Turkish intelligence services and handed over to the CIA. He was praised in the press as a swimmer to freedom. Oreshkov was airlifted to New York to avoid Soviet extradition, provided financial assistance, and eventually granted US citizenship. Just 2 months after obtaining his American citizenship, he left the US for a 2-month vacation in socialist Bulgaria. And where do you think he ended up? At the gates of the Soviet embassy, asking to be allowed back into the USSR to his mom. On his return to Moscow, the sailor underwent a second series of interrogations, now from the KGB. He told the KGB that his decision to jump from the ship was not a political act, but actually the result of a quarrel with the ship's captain about his dog on board the ship. And apparently they believed him, as the charges of state treason were dropped and Oreshkov stayed with his parents in the USSR. But even that wasn't the end of it. 2 years after his return to the Soviet Union, he asked the US embassy in Moscow to take him back. By this point, neither superpower considered him a welcomed migrant, not from an intelligence standpoint, nor in terms of any propaganda value he might represent. Oh, and the Soviets seemed eager to get rid of him. Although US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was extremely reluctant to take him back, the Americans eventually had to relent because he had US citizenship. Aryshkov was brought back to New York in April 1975, and they did their best to make him disappear from the public eye forever. You will ask me, why didn't ordinary Soviet tourists flee? Why all these troubles with jumping into the ocean and hijacking airplanes? Citizens of the Soviet Union were able to sometimes get a cherished tourist voucher and then just ask for asylum. It's simple. First, anyone living in the USSR had to get a special document, an exit visa, and to get it you had to go through 7 circles of hell, including a thorough check by the police and the KGB. And anyone who had a tendency to escape was simply not allowed to get to that opportunity. Secondly, a mere mortal in 90% of cases could get a ticket to friendly socialist countries, the same Bulgaria, from which he would be instantly brought back. Only the most reliable tourists were accepted to capitalist countries, preferably tourists with families, so that family members would stay in the USSR and any potential escape would be more difficult morally. Their travel schedules were drawn up almost minute by minute, and of course a special nanny, a KGB agent, was always sent with any tourist group. Finally, even if you got a ticket to France by some miracle, it was easier for the French authorities to quietly hand you back than to cause an international scandal. Therefore, such a simple scheme did not work either, although there was at least one person who managed to escape in this way: Dmitry Sokolenko, a 25-year-old native of Novosibirsk. Much of his success was due to a good choice of country. He chose India. On the one hand, it was not a popular destination, easier to obtain permission to travel. And on the other hand, although friendly, it was not a socialist country, so there was less risk of extradition. Dmitry flew there, ran out of the hotel, got to the American embassy, where they listened to him and advised him to rush back. After all, in 1986 the Cold War was almost over, he was of no interest. For 2 weeks he hid in a UN refugee shelter until he met some kind-hearted Dutchman who paid $5,000 to Afghan smugglers for Sokolenko's transportation to Nepal, where he got the name Sebastian Fernandez, caught hepatitis, but successfully made it to Pakistan and then to France. Simply crossing the border was also dangerous, for the USSR had extradition agreements with almost all of its neighbors. So in July 1974, 4 friends decided to flee the USSR. The oldest of them all, Anatoly, had served 5 years ago in Karelia, on the border with Finland. He convinced the others that it would be easy to cross, and all that could happen in case of failure was a maximum of 3 years in prison. They were lucky. By a happy coincidence, they managed to cross the border undetected. They knew about the extradition treaty, so they intended to walk almost 300 kilometers on foot through the forest to Sweden. But at the first halt they were seized and immediately handed over to the Soviet authorities, who did not hesitate to send them to a psychological hospital for forced treatment, which in Soviet times was almost worse than a regular prison. Again, though, there were successful cases here as well. For example, the case of Agafon Fabergé, son of the legendary jeweler Carl Fabergé. He was not given a visa to Finland, so in 1927 there was no extradition agreement with the Finns at that time. He decided to take a risky gamble, crossing the Soviet-Finnish border through the frozen Gulf of Finland with the help of smugglers. The fugitives were put in a sledge and sent on the ice towards Finland. But they were spotted by the border guards, who after a few warning shots in the air, opened fire to kill them. Fabergé Jr.'s family survived only by a miracle. He himself was wounded in the arm. The philosopher Ivan Solonevich and his son became the owners of a unique achievement. They not only escaped to Finland, but did it straight from the Gulag camp, where they were sent for a previous attempt to escape from the country. 16 days after they escaped from the camp, they walked to the Soviet-Finnish border, smearing their boots with smoked lard crust, tincture of mahorka and ammonia to throw the search dogs off the trail. And they did. Finally, strange as that may seem, it was theoretically possible to escape from the USSR to equally communist China, when relations between the neighbors escalated. Anatoly Bulyov, the son of an enemy of the people and a dissident, did so. In 1963, Bulyov made the long journey from Astrakhan through Moscow and Khabarovsk to the border town of Bikin, and then settled in the village of Vasilievka, located near it, where the border post was located. The crossing itself turned out to be ridiculously simple. He began to explore the border and noticed a service gate in the intimidating barbed wire fence, through which he slipped away into the night. The only thing left to do was to swim across the Ussuri River, which he barely accomplished. In China, he was going to assemble some groups to carry out the revolution in his native land. He was well received in China, but the dissident soon became disillusioned with Chinese communism and was deported back. Well, from today's video we learned that you were indeed sometimes welcome on the other side of the Iron Curtain, sometimes even if you were a terrorist and murderer. And if you were going to jump off a cruise ship into the ocean, you better try to wear a red swimsuit so that the media would know about it as soon as possible. Otherwise, foreign governments didn't really care for you. Although, of course, we probably don't know all the stories, and there may have been hundreds of people who successfully crossed, for example, the borders of the Georgian USSR and Turkey, but we will never know the story of their success. Or the story of how they were shot by border guards and their corpses were eaten by wild animals. Thanks for watching. If you wish to support the channel financially, you can do so with crypto or by subscribing to my Patreon. And as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Yelizaveta, Kirill, Klimuk, Böse, Jimmy, Albin, Petar, Ilic, Bruce, Eternick, and MHS. See you guys next time.